Hey everyone, how's it going? I just want to start this video off by saying Happy New Year, and I figured this would be a really uh, great video to start 2019 off with, um, because it was 30 years ago that really I got into heavy metal, as my main musical interest and an all-consuming obsession, right? If that had not happened, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys right now, that's for sure. So let's go ahead and I'm going to retrace some stuff. And for those of you who are longtime viewers, I apologize because I am going to definitely be revisiting some things I've said in other videos. But I'm also going to expand, beyond what I've said before in other videos. So, uh, obviously this is called 30 Years A Metalhead. So I'm going to tell the story of how I got into metal, how my musical taste expanded in the genre, and kind of how I felt about it back then and how I feel about it now. So let's go ahead and dive in. So really, my story starts back in the year of 1989. Uh, I was turning, 1980. I was turning 11 years old. And I specifically remember being interested in music. Basically, what I mean by that is prior to that time, age 10 and back, I hadn't really tried to develop much what I would call musical taste, right? I was aware of music, of course, and I heard the radio, listened to some of my parents' records and stuff like that, but I wasn't really swimming in music per se. It wasn't extremely into my consciousness yet. So, but that was the kind of the year I decided, hey, I really want to start developing my own musical taste, right? It was just, I don't know why, it's just something in me just kind of, some switch flipped, and it was like, it's time. So, for my 11th birthday, which is in September, I asked my parents for they got me a dual cassette Sony boombox, which sadly I no longer have. Um, so they got me a couple of albums to go with it. Now, I think I actually got the present early that year. I think I got it during the summertime. I might have gotten it in like July or August or something. So it was before my birthday. So I remember going to Kmart with my parents and picking this thing out. It was and of course it was a Sony boombox because it had to be a Sony. It couldn't be any other brand. It had to be Sony, right? So it was a Sony Soundwriter. I remember at least that level of detail, right? And I was in the music I knew I wanted to listen to was in the hard rock side of things, right? Because I kind of knew a little bit that that's kind of the direction I wanted to go, and I kind of knew I had an interest in it. I just didn't know much about. Really, the only music I knew really well up to that point was Thriller. I knew that backwards and forwards because my parents got that for me when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I listened to it endlessly. I did listen to a lot of classic rock and stuff for my parents' record collection and all that, but I knew that I wanted something a little harder edged or whatever. So we went to Kmart, and we were talking to the sales woman, and I asked her. She was a young woman, probably 19 to 21, somewhere in that range. So she was a fairly young person. And I remember asking her for advice, asking a girl for advice on hard rock music. Let's be honest, fellas, most of the time that's not a great idea, and it certainly wasn't in 1989. And she actually suggested two albums, and I have to give her credit. One of the albums she suggested is absolutely fantastic. The other one, not so much. I'm going to show the less fantastic album first. And one of the albums she suggested was this one's Poison, Open Up and Say Ah. And what's my opinion of this? My opinion, of course, it was on cassette, not CD. My opinion of this is it's okay for what it is. It's pop metal. It's it's not terribly interesting, but it's fun to listen to. It can definitely be a lot of fun to listen to, but it doesn't really scratch much of an itch. And even back when I was new to music, I knew that this was vastly inferior to the other album that I'm about to show up. Um, I thought it was okay at the time, and I kind of liked it. I mean, I know every song on this backwards and forwards because, gotta keep in mind, you got an album back then, you listen to the hell out of it, regardless of how much, you may like. But even back then, I was like, yeah, I like it, but it's just kind of okay. So that was my opinion then, and that's still honestly my opinion now. So let's put that one down. The other album I got was Skid Row's self-titled debut. And I thought this album was absolutely amazing and incredible. I heard it and I was like, wow, this is so much better. Because let's face it, this is way heavier than Poison. A million times. It's not even on the same level. The talent here versus Poison, it's a huge, gigantic difference. I heard this and I was like, wow, this is absolutely just amazing. So, what's my opinion of this album overall 30 years later? I still really like it. In fact, it's still absolutely one of my favorite debut albums of all time. That is a video idea I'll have to do. Talk about my favorite debut albums of all time, and that'll be actually probably a fairly easy list, but this one's definitely going on it. So there you go. I love this, and I still love this. So after I heard those two albums, I really liked them, and then I don't know. Let's see. Not much time passed. In fact, I remember. I don't know exactly when this was. It might have been late September when we did this because I remember the weather was actually it was still warm outside. It was still you could still wear shorts and not be cold. So I'm sure it was still fairly close to my birthday when this happened, and we went to a flea market, and I saw the following album in the flea market, and I had heard of this band, obviously. I knew they existed. I knew of them, but I had no idea what their music actually sounded like. I was like, yeah, I know they're a band, but I don't know anything about them. I don't know what they, whatever. And I was highly curious to find out about them. So at that point, I got an allowance back then for, cleaning the house or whatever. So I decided to use my money and buy the cassette version of this album, Master of Puppets. And the reason I chose this is obviously I was curious about Metallica, and the album cover really drew me in, right? It was very compelling to me. I really liked, the hands and the, lines down to the gravestones and everything. I thought this was one of those most amazing things I had ever seen up to that point in my life, right? I just was like, wow, that is so cool. And I thought, honestly, this looks even cooler on the cassette J card because they have to change the perspective of this. So you actually see the hands beneath the logo, or at least I think on my copy you did. And I just loved the way that looked. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. I took this home and played it. And obviously, when I heard this, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, that was my reaction. I couldn't believe how incredibly great this was, right? I just couldn't believe my ears. I was like, wow, that is the most amazing music I've ever heard in my entire life. So, yeah, I became an instant Metallica fanatic, after hearing this. And, yeah, I knew that it would not be long before I got more of their music. So, a couple months later, it was winter time by this time, so I remember it was cold outside. Maybe it was December, I don't know. And we were at a store that doesn't exist anymore in the Cincinnati. It used to be in the Cincinnati area. It was called Swallens, and it was a multi-floor department store. And in the basement, that was the only part I ever really gave a shit about going to. They had electronics, video games, and music, right? So I went there, and I immediately went right, looked for Metallica releases, and I got And Justice for All and Ride the Lightning. And of course, I of course love the hell out of those albums. They're still some of my favorite albums today. That hasn't changed, right? So there you go. That my opinion is still extremely high of those albums. So there you go. By this time, we're getting into I don't know, however many months later. After I had really acclimated to these Metallica albums, um, you know, I knew I wanted to expand into other bands. I wanted to start checking out other stuff. And the next obvious choice, of course, was Megadeth, right? So at some point in 1990, I don't know exactly when, I think I got these two out. It's hard for me to remember because now we're going way into fuzzier details. I got these two albums on cassette, and of course, you know, what's my opinion of Rust in Peace and So Far So Good So What? Then, of course, they blew me away, and today, I still think they're amazing. They're still absolutely incredibly great thrash masterpieces, in my opinion. Obviously, Rust in Peace ranks higher, but it's still So Far So Good So What? Still amazing. And from there, after that, I got this album, Slayer, Seasons in the Abyss. Actually, it took me a while to get into this. I'll explain because I am going to do a Slayer-focused video. It took me a little while to get into Slayer, and I'll explain why when I talk about Slayer, but this was kind of the next band that I checked out. And then after that, I just went, from there it was just thrash all day long. Anthrax, Overkill, Testament, Exodus, just on and on and on and on and on. I'm not going to name off all the bands. You get the idea. You guys all know who the major thrash bands were of the time, and that's pretty much what I consumed myself with. And at first, it was slow going because you have to keep in mind I was a child, right? And I didn't really get around too much on my own. The only money I had was money I got from, allowances, and the only time I could buy albums is when, my parents went somewhere that sold albums that I wanted, and I happened to go with them, right? So, slow going at first. You got to keep in mind this is back in, for you young folks out here, this is way before the internet was a thing. We had to physically buy these things. There was no other way to hear music. So, it's slow going at first, and it grew over time. And then, a few years later, it's hard for me to remember exactly what year this was. It was probably, I know it was high school. It was, I don't know, we'll say the 94, 95 time. No, it was more, it was before that. We'll say maybe 92. Yeah, I think 92, 93 is probably about right. I decided I wanted to, quote, go back in time with listening to older metal, because I had pretty much caught up at that point with all the, quote, modern stuff, and I knew I wanted to listen to more of the foundations of metal. And of course, a band that I decided to start with, and this was the first band that was, quote, more classic that I really listened to, was these guys, Iron Maiden, of course. And we got Fear of the Dark here because this is the first Iron Maiden album I ever owned. I had it on cassette. In fact, this is the only Maiden album I ever owned on cassette, because not long after I started listening to this, I switched to CDs. But This is still one of my favorite Maiden albums to today. I already did a Maiden ranking video. You can find that if you want to, but this is close to the top of the list. I still really think this is an absolutely fantastic album, and I did back then. Then the next logical band to check out after that was Judas Priest. And obviously, this is my favorite Priest record. But honestly, I couldn't tell you which one was the first one I listened to. I don't know if it was Painkiller. But whatever album it was that I heard at roughly that time turned me into a gigantic Judas Priest fan, right? No doubt that I love the hell out of Judas Priest. So, yeah, there you go. And then, of course, I went all the way back to the beginning with Black Sabbath. What can I really say about this album? I thought it was amazing then, and I still think it's amazing now. 20-some, we're 20-some years in the past, but still pretty far back that I was listening to this stuff. And then, of course, from there, I kept up with the newer stuff in metal and just expanded my palette, so to speak. I started listening to power metal, death metal, progressive metal, industrial metal, you get the idea, right? I just started really consuming heavy metal in all of its myriad forms very, very, very heavily. So that it just became my obsession, and my music collection just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. You get the general gist of this. So that's pretty much how I started in metal, and my feelings about it at the time was I thought it was the most fascinating musical style that existed, and so interesting because metal was still growing at that point a lot, and I was young, so I had lots of time to really absorb all this stuff, and I just found it absolutely fascinating. And as far as how it affected me emotionally back at those times, when I was a young person, I actually had a fairly hard time in a lot of aspects of life. So metal, being the aggressive kind of angry music that it is, really spoke to me at that time in my life, much more so than any other musical form could. So it really connected with me on a visceral, emotional level that literally nothing else could. But as I aged through my teens, I expanded my music taste, in my opinion, fairly significantly because, of course, I started getting into more, aside from just hard rock and heavy metal, I started expanding much more into classic rock when I was in high school. I started listening to a lot of Doors, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Ace, all that stuff, Pink Floyd, all the stereotypical stuff. I started really absorbing all of that as well. So that's pretty much what happened. And as far as my musical taste today, it's still honestly, it's still pretty similar to when I was a young person. It's expanded a bit more since then. I now appreciate, Johnny Cash is one of my favorite artists. That happened after I was an adult, by the way. I didn't listen to Johnny Cash whatsoever when I was a, quote, really young person. That happened later on, and I absolutely adore his music now. I can appreciate pop music actually better than I used to be able to. My opinion of pretty much all pop music, aside from Michael Jackson when I was young, is I thought it was all pretty much shit, and I couldn't stand it. Whereas now, I can have an appreciation for a decent variety of pop music. I still think a lot of it is shit, by the way, but I do like much more of it than I used to. So how do I feel about heavy metal now versus then? Well, emotionally, I'm not as angry as I was when I was young. I mean, obviously, I still have my, quote, dark and angry moments, even now at my age. I think everyone does. I think that's natural and human, right? So it still can help out in those situations. But as far as, am I sick of metal at this point? Am I like, oh God, I've been listening to this for 30 years? No, I'm not, because I still love, like, the initial things that drew me to metal are still what keeps me listening to metal. I still love the sound of it. You know, I love the guitar riffs. I love the drums. I love the various vocal styles. I just love the way it sounds, everything about it. So, yeah, there are styles of metal I don't really particularly care for, but I'm not going to yammer on about those. And I think there's still enough really new, good heavy metal being produced to keep my interest in the genre. But I will agree with Metal Mickey on one point, though. The Andy Sneap production that's on everything is kind of growing very tiresome. But at least there is still a lot of killer music out there. Hopefully they do that production style goes away at some point, or at least produces. So anyway, that's it. I just kind of wanted to share kind of where I was, where I am now. Also, do I think I'll be listening to metal 30 years from now when I'm 70 years old? Probably. You know, it's habits don't tend to change too much when it comes to music with folks. I don't see myself abandoning metal music at any point. I've really no reason to. I think I'm going to be listening to it for as long as I live. So that's pretty much it. If you made it all the way through this, I really appreciate it. You know, it was just one of those kind of personal story time things, but I thought just be nice to share. Anyway, if you like this, as always, thumbs up. If you hate me, thumbs down, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you guys in the next one.